The red paint was still wet when Elena Wren reached the gate. It ran down the weathered boards in 3 crooked lines. Bright as a wound against gray wood. Beneath it, nailed hard into the post, was a notice from the Dry Creek loan office. Road under claim. No hauling after sunrise. For a moment, Elena could not hear the wind. She could only hear her father coughing inside the house, the sound carrying thinly through the open window behind her. Silas Wren had built that road with his own hands 26 years ago. Cutting through stone, pine root, and stubborn clay so wagons could pull timber down from the slope to the valley depot. Now 2 men in pressed coats stood beside the gate, as if they owned the dust under their boots. One of them still held the paintbrush. "You had no right," Elena said. The taller man looked at her the way men looked at women before explaining a thing they already understood. "Miss Wren, the debt is past due. The debt is on the house and south field, not the road. The road is listed as attached access. That road feeds 3 mills, 2 farms, and every wagon that comes down from the North Ridge. Then folks will need to find another way. There is no other way." He folded the notice flat against the post with 2 fingers. "That is unfortunate." Unfortunate. The word sat cold in Elena's mouth. Behind her, Nora came running from the house. Her apron half-tied. Flour on one cheek. At 19, Nora still looked too young for the fear she had been wearing all spring. "What happened?" Elena did not answer. She kept her eyes on the red paint. Nora saw it and went still. "Oh, Lord!" The man with the brush cleared his throat. "At sunrise. No wagon crosses this gate unless authorized by Dry Creek loan office. Any timber moved after that will be counted as seized property." Elena turned on him. "We have a delivery due tomorrow. That would be a matter between you and your buyer. If we miss it, the penalty doubles the debt." The taller man finally smiled. "Not wide. Just enough. That would also be unfortunate." And then Elena understood. This was not about collecting what her father owed. This was about making sure he could never pay it. The men climbed into their wagon and drove off toward town, leaving red tracks where paint had dripped into the dust. Nora gripped the gate rail. "Elena, what do we do?" Elena looked past the gate to the stacked lumber waiting under canvas. 47 good boards. Cut. Dried. Marked. And promised. Her father had taken that order himself before he became too weak to hold a pencil. If they delivered it, they bought another month. If they failed, the loan office would take the house before Silas Wren could finish dying in his own bed. Inside, her father coughed again. Nora's voice dropped. Evan Miller asked again. Elena closed her eyes. "No. He has room at Willow Bend." "No. He said Papa could come too. And you would marry a man you do not love so he can feel charitable in front of church." Nora's face tightened. But tears stood in her eyes. "I would marry him so Papa has a roof." Elena turned back to the road. The red paint shone in the afternoon light. "No," she said again. Softer this time. "Not yet." She took the notice off the post, folded it once, and tucked it into her pocket. "Where are you going?" Nora asked. "To Tanner's trading post." "What for?" "To find out who wants that road badly enough to close it before the debt is due." The trading post sat 3 miles east where the wagon road met the old mountain trail. By the time Elena arrived, the sun had dropped behind the pines, and the windows glowed amber from lamplight. Old Tanner looked up from weighing coffee beans when she stepped inside. "Elena Wren," he said. "You look like trouble found you first. Who owns Dry Creek loan office?" Tanner's hand stopped over the scale. "That is not a small question." "Then give me the large answer." He studied her for a long moment, then reached under the counter and placed a small wooden tag in front of her. It was a board-foot inspection tag. Already paid and stamped. The buyer's name was written in dark ink. Caleb Ashford. Elena stared at it. "I do not know him," she said. "No. Tanner replied. But he knows your road. Before Elena could ask another question, hoofbeats sounded outside. Slow. Heavy. Coming down from the mountain trail. The hoofbeats stopped outside Tanner's trading post. No one inside moved. Old Tanner looked toward the door. Then at Elena. And his face changed in a way she did not like. Not fear exactly. Recognition. The door opened, bringing in the smell of cold pine and horse sweat. A man stepped inside with snow dusting the shoulders of his dark coat. Though there was no snow yet in the valley. That meant he had come from higher country. Mountain country. The kind of place where trails disappeared under weather and men learned not to waste words. He removed his hat. Elena Wren. She did not answer at once. He was older than her. Perhaps 34. With dark hair. A weathered face. And eyes that looked at things as if they were measurements. Not soft. Not cruel. Exact. You are Caleb Ashford. She said. His gaze flicked to the wooden inspection tag on the counter. I am. Tanner suddenly found something important to do with the coffee scale. Elena picked up the tag. You paid for board foot inspection on timber that has not been delivered. I paid for timber your father promised. My father is sick. I know. Her hand tightened around the tag. And my road has been marked closed. I know that too. The calm in his voice made anger rise in her. Then you also know no wagon can cross after sunrise unless Dry Creek Loan Office allows it. Caleb stepped closer to the counter but kept distance between them. Dry Creek does not want your money. He said. It wants the road. Elena went still. Tanner glanced up once. Then back down. Caleb continued. Wren Road is the only low-grade haul route between the North Timber Slope and the Valley Depot. Whoever owns that road controls which mills can ship before winter. Victor Merrick knows it. So do I. The name struck the room like a dropped iron weight. Merrick. Elena said. Caleb nodded once. Dry Creek Loan Office carries his money behind other men's names. Elena thought of the red paint. The false patience in the collector's smile. The way the debt had swollen every time her father missed a payment by even a day. It was never about our house. She said. No. It was about cutting off your mill. And every smaller hauler behind me. She set the tag down carefully. And then why come to me? Because your father still owns the road until sunrise. That sounds like something a lawyer says before stealing it. A faint expression touched his mouth and vanished. Fair. He reached into his coat and placed a folded paper on the counter. Not money. A contract. Elena did not touch it. What is that? A way to keep Wren Road from Merrick. By selling it to you. No. By attaching it to Ashford Timber and Mill through marriage. The room seemed to shrink. Tanner stopped pretending not to listen. Elena stared at Caleb. You came here to buy a wife with a road. I came here because you have 47 boards under canvas. A sick father. A sister thinking about marrying for shelter. And a red mark on your gate that becomes law at sunrise. Heat climbed into Elena's face. Do not speak about my sister. Then do not let Merrick write her future. She almost slapped him. The only thing that stopped her was the truth sitting between them. Caleb unfolded the paper and turned it toward her. If we marry before the claim is finalized. Wren Road becomes marital access tied to my operating contract. Dry Creek cannot seize it without challenging my whole company. That buys time. Enough to pay your father's debt properly. Enough to deliver the timber. Enough to make Merrick fight in daylight. Elena looked down at the paper. There were lines for signatures. Terms, witnesses. Property descriptions. It was ugly. It was practical. It was exactly the kind of thing desperate people hated because it might work. And what do you get? She asked. Legal access to the Valley Road. And a wife. Yes. What kind? His eyes met hers. Not a quiet one. That stopped her more than any compliment would have. I need someone who knows that road. He said. Someone who knows the town. The debt. The haulers. The family's Merrick has cornered. I need someone who can read a bad number before it ruins a good man. Elena looked at Tanner. The old trader did not rescue her. He only looked sad enough to tell her the offer was not madness. She turned back to Caleb. I have terms. Name them. My father remains in his house until his last day. Yes. Nora is not part of this bargain. Not as labor. Not as leverage. Not as gratitude. Yes. I see every ledger your mill keeps. Every debt. Vage. Contract. And road fee. Caleb studied her for one long moment. Then he reached into his pocket and placed a coil of worn measuring cord beside the contract. My father used that cord to measure the first timber Ashford ever sold. He said. If I lie in the books, keep it as proof against me. Elena touched the cord. It was rough. Dark from years of hands and weather. Marriage by sunrise. He said. Or Merrick owns the gate. Outside. The mountain wind pushed against the trading post door. Elena thought of red paint on gray wood. Nora's face. Her father coughing in the room he had built. 47 boards waiting under canvas. Then she picked up the pen. Not because I trust you. She said. Caleb nodded. Because you understand the road. Elena signed her name. By noon. Elena Wren was Elena Ashford. Bedusk. She understood Caleb had lied without speaking a false word. He had said he ran a timber mill in the mountains. He had not said the road would climb for 5 hours. Past black pines and cold springs. Until the valley opened beneath them like a hidden country. He had not said the mill would be large enough to shake the ground. He had not said smoke would rise from 3 chimneys. Or that wagons would be lined beneath canvas sheds. Or that 15 men would stop working when his horse came down the ridge. He had not said the poor mountain logger owned half the valley. Elena sat beside him on the wagon bench. Still wearing the plain blue dress she had worn for the ceremony. The vows were barely dry in the county book. Her father had watched from his chair by the window. Nora had cried without making a sound. Caleb had paid the debt. Witnessed the row transfer. And loaded Elena's single trunk before the loan office could breathe on the gate again. Now, the mountain air cut through her sleeves. That is your mill? She asked. Our mill. Caleb said. She looked at him sharply. Do not use kind words to cover missing ones. He took that without flinching. Fair. The wagon rolled past stacked logs marked with chalk. A water wheel turned beside the river. Heavy and steady. Men guided boards along a covered track toward the drying sheds. Every movement looked practiced. Not rich in a polished way. Rich in labor. Planning. And things that had been built because someone refused to ask permission. 2 workers came forward when the wagon stopped. This is Martinvale. Caleb said. He runs the yard when I'm away. And Owen Pike. Mill foreman. Both men removed their hats. Mrs. Ashford. Martin said. The name struck her strangely. Not because it was new. Because everyone waited to see what she would do with it. Elena stepped down before Caleb could offer a hand. Her boots hit the packed dirt. The yard smelled of fresh pine. River water. Horse sweat. And sawdust. I need to see where the Wren boards will be stored. She said. Owen blinked. Caleb's mouth moved. Almost a smile. You heard her. The boards had arrived before them. Pulled through before the red mark became law. 47 pieces under canvas. Each one bearing her father's chalk mark. Elena touched the first board lightly. Her throat tightened. Silas Wren had measured these before fever took the strength from his hands. Caleb stood a step behind her. They will be paid for tonight. They will be delivered first. She said. Then paid for. Martin glanced at Caleb. Unsure. Caleb nodded. Delivered first. That nod told Elena more than his words had. The next morning. Caleb showed her the office. It was a long room above the mill floor. With windows looking down over the yard. Maps covered one wall. Ledgers filled 2 shelves. Contracts lay in neat stacks on the desk. At first glance, it looked orderly. Then Elena opened the first book. By the 3rd page, she saw the trouble. By the 10th, she knew it was worse. These wage columns are clean, she said. Caleb leaned against the desk. I pay fair. I did not say you didn't. I said the wage columns are clean. The road fees are not. He straightened. Elena turned the ledger toward him. Here. Same route. Same load weight. Different fee. Here again. Payment recorded. But no witness mark. This timber lot says purchased from a trapper named Baines. But there is no bill of sale attached. Baines couldn't write. Then someone should have witnessed his mark. Caleb was quiet. She pulled another ledger from the shelf. You know the forest. You know the river. You know how to build a mill out of rock and stubbornness. But Merrick does not need to outwork you. He only needs to make your paper look like smoke. The words landed. Below them, the saw screamed through a log. Caleb looked out the window at the men working in the yard. Can it be fixed? Yes? How long? If you answer every question honestly. 30 days to make it defensible. Longer to make it strong. And if I don't answer honestly? She met his eyes. Then I take my sister and father's roof money. And I go home before your bad numbers bury us both. For a moment. He said nothing. Then he pulled out the chair at the head of the desk and turned it toward her. Start where you need to start. Elena sat. By evening, she had created a new book. On the first page, she wrote: Board foot ledger. Load. Grade. Road. Witness. Time out. Time received. Caleb watched her sharpen the pencil with a small knife. Her sleeves rolled. Her hair slipping loose from its pins. You did this for your father? He asked. I did this because no one else thought a woman counting boards was worth fearing. And are you? She looked down at the blank columns. I intend to be. The next morning, every foreman was called into the office. Caleb stood by the wall. Elena sat at the desk. And when Martin began his report by looking at Caleb, Caleb said, Not to me. Martin turned slowly. Elena opened the ledger. Start with the North Road. She said. No one smiled. No one laughed. And for the first time since the red paint touched Wren Road, Elena felt the gate swing open in her own hands. The letter from Victor Merrick arrived on cream paper with a gold seal. Elena knew his name before she broke the wax. No honest man sent paper that heavy to a sawmill. She stood in Caleb's office with the morning ledger open beneath her hand. Outside, wagons rolled through the yard. Each load tagged with her new board foot slips. The men had stopped grumbling by the 3rd day. Mostly because the numbers had started protecting them too. A missing mark no longer meant blame. It meant a place to look. Caleb came in from the mill floor. Saw her face. And shut the door. What is it? She handed him the letter. He read it once. Then again. Merrick wants you in Sacramento. He said. He says he wants a peaceful discussion. That means he wants witnesses of his choosing. Elena took the letter back. He asked for me. Not you. Because he thinks you are the handle. The handle. The part of the axe a man grabs when he means to swing it. She folded the letter carefully. Then he should mind the edge. Caleb did not smile. You do not have to go. Yes. I do. Elena. If I stay here. He writes the story without me. If I go. I hear what he is afraid to say in front of you. Caleb walked to the window. Below. Martin was checking the chalk marks on a load bound for the valley. The whole operation moved because Elena had made every board answer for itself. At last. Caleb said. You take Jonas Bell. The lawyer. The best one we can afford. And you. I stay here and keep the mill running. Merrick would enjoy knowing his letter stopped the work. That answer pleased her more than she wanted it to. 2 days later. Elena sat across from Victor Merrick in a polished room above a Sacramento lumber office. He was not large. Not loud. Not rough. That made him worse. He wore a gray suit. Silver cufflinks. And the calm expression of a man who had learned that cruelty sounded better when spoken softly. Beside him sat a lawyer with narrow hands and a thick folder. Near the window stood a woman in a dark green dress. Taking notes. She did not look at Elena long. But when she did, there was something sharp and warning in her eyes. "Mrs. Ashford," Merrick said. "Your husband has built an impressive concern for a man with no formal training." Elena placed her gloves on the table. "My husband builds things that stand." A flicker crossed Merrick's face. "Then you understand why I hoped to spare him a fall." He opened the folder. "Ashford Timber has no clean right to haul through Wren Road. The road debt. The access claim. The valley grade permits. Messy little things. In court, messy things become expensive." Jonas Bell leaned forward. "If you have a claim, file it." Merrick ignored him and looked only at Elena. "I am prepared to purchase the mill, the road rights, and all current timber contracts for a generous sum. Enough for you and Mr. Ashford to live comfortably. Enough to move your father where he can receive better care." Elena's fingers went still. There it was. Not a threat against Caleb. Against Silas. She kept her voice level. "My father is not for sale. Everything is for sale when the alternative is loss." "No," Elena said. "Some things only reveal the buyer." The lawyer's mouth tightened. Merrick's smile thinned. "Very well. Then let us discuss inspection. Your next railroad sample load will be reviewed at the Valley Depot. If it fails grade or comes up short in measure, Ashford Timber will be removed from consideration before final bid. Our lumber will not fail. Confidence is charming." Merrick closed the folder. "Records, however, are persuasive." Elena understood before he finished. He had someone at the depot. Someone who could measure a true board and call it short. Someone who could mark clean pine as inferior and make ink look like fact. She stood. "Then we will bring records." Merrick rose with her. "Bring whatever comforts you." In the hallway, Jonas began whispering about strategy. But Elena stopped when the woman in green stepped from a side door. "Mrs. Ashford," she said quietly. "My name is Evelyn Park. I keep Mr. Merrick's appointment books." Eunice stiffened. Evelyn pressed a folded scrap into Elena's glove. "Do not open it here." Then she walked away. Elena waited until they were outside. Behind a carriage shed smelling of rain and horse leather. She unfolded the scrap. 3 names. 1 depot inspector. 1 payment amount. 1 date. Jonas read over her shoulder. "That is tomorrow." Elena looked toward the rail yard, where smoke rose beyond the rooftops. "He is not going to beat us in court," she said. "He is going to make the wood lie first." When she reached Ashford Valley that night, Caleb was waiting by the mill lamp. She handed him the note. His face darkened as he read. "I will ride down there myself," he said. "No, Elena. If Merrick bought the inspector, then every man expects you to come angry and look guilty." She took the measuring cord from the desk and wrapped it once around her hand. "Tomorrow, we measure in public." Caleb stared at her. "The depot yard," she said. "Railroad officer. Town clerk. Rival mill owners. Haulers. Workers. Everyone who has ever been told Merrick's numbers are the only numbers that count. And if they laugh." Elena looked at the cord. "Then they can laugh while they measure." By sunrise, the Valley Depot looked like a town fair. No one wanted to attend. Wagons lined the rail yard. Their wheels sunk into damp dirt. Teamsters stood near their horses. Hats pulled low, pretending not to stare. Men from 3 rival mills gathered by the loading platform. Some curious. Some amused. Some hoping Ashford Timber would fail loudly enough to make their own troubles look smaller. Victor Merrick arrived last. That was no accident. He stepped down from a black carriage in a clean gray coat, with 2 clerks behind him and the depot inspector walking at his side. The inspector, Mr. Rell, carried a measuring stick under one arm and the stiff expression of a man who had already decided what the wood would say. Elena stood beside the first Ashford wagon with Caleb's measuring cord coiled in her hand. Caleb was there, but he did not stand in front of her. That mattered. Nolan Yardley, owner of a small mill west of Dry Creek, leaned toward another man and muttered. Ashford sent his wife to count boards. Elena heard him. She let him. The railroad officer, Edwin Carver, arrived with a leather case and an ink-stained cuff. He looked from Merrick to Elena, then to the wagons. Mrs. Ashford, he said. You requested public remeasurement. I did. Mr. Rell cleared his throat. Unnecessary. In my professional opinion, I have already inspected the sample load and found it short. Elena said. Correct. By how much? Rell opened his notebook. 9% volume deficiency. 2 grade failures. Moisture concerns. A murmur moved through the yard. Caleb's jaw tightened, but he stayed silent. Elena lifted one of her board foot tags. Then we will measure again. Wagon by wagon. Board by board. In front of everyone who has lost money trusting private numbers. That last sentence changed the air. A teamster looked up. One rival mill owner stopped smiling. Merrick's eyes narrowed. Carver studied Elena for a breath, then nodded. Proceed. Rell stepped forward. I am the appointed inspector. Then inspect. Elena said. Out loud. The first board came down. Martin Vale placed it across 2 sawhorses. Elena read the chalk mark. Rell measured length, width, thickness. Jonas Bell wrote the figures. Carver checked them. Then Elena compared them against her ledger. Matches, she said. Second board. Matches. Third. Matches. By the 12th board, the yard had gone quiet. By the 20th, Rell's face had begun to shine with sweat despite the cold. Merrick spoke smoothly. A few correct boards do not prove a full load. No. Elena said. That is why we brought the full load. A low sound moved through the men. Not laughter. Not yet respect. Something between. Then came the marked board. Elena knew it before it left the wagon. The chalk was hers. But the inspection notch had been cut twice. Someone had tried to make it look shorter at the end. Rell picked it up too fast. This one fails, he said. Elena held out her hand. Set it down. He hesitated. Set it down. Mr. Rell. Caleb took one step forward. Elena did not look at him. Rell set the board down. She placed Caleb's measuring cord along the full length, then pointed to the second notch. This cut was made after drying, she said. The exposed grain is fresh. Carver bent closer. Nolan Yardley stepped forward before anyone invited him. She's right. That edge was shaved this morning or yesterday. Merrick turned toward him. Careful. Yardley. Nolan looked at the board. Then at Merrick. I have been careful for 6 years. It has cost me plenty. The yard shifted again. Elena reached into her pocket and removed Evelyn Park's folded note. She did not hand it to the crowd. She handed it to Carver. Payment date. Name. Amount. She said. Enough to pause the inspection. Enough to ask who wanted this load to fail before it was measured. Carver read it. His expression hardened. Mr. Rell, he said. Step away from the cargo. Rell opened his mouth, then closed it. Merrick's face did not change, but his hand tightened around his gloves. Carver turned to Elena. Mrs. Ashford, can your mill meet the railroad schedule? If this load is accepted. Yes. Can you prove capacity? Elena opened the board foot ledger. Load records. Road times. Drying shed counts. Worker witness marks. Alternate route plan for spring washout. And a backup arrangement with Morrison Mill if our saw line breaks. Carver looked surprised. You prepared for failure. I prepared to deliver. For the first time that morning. Caleb smiled. Not proudly enough for others to see. Just enough for her. Carver closed the ledger. Ashford timber remains in final consideration. Merrick stepped close enough for only Elena to hear. You want a morning? Elena looked at the wagons. The men. The ledger. The measuring cord dark against her palm. No. She said. I won the right to count in daylight. Then Caleb stepped beside her. Placed the cord fully in her hand. And said to Carver. Mrs. Ashford will present our final bid. The yard went still. Elena lifted her chin. This time. No one laughed. The railroad contract was awarded on a Thursday. Not to Merrick Lumber Combine. To Ashford Timber and Mill. The telegram arrived at sunrise. Carried up the mountain by a boy on a lathered pony who looked half frozen and entirely proud of himself. Caleb opened it in the yard with sawdust on his sleeves and Elena standing close enough to read the words before he spoke them. 18-month supply approved. Delivery terms accepted. First shipment due in 30 days. For one breath. No one moved. Then Martin shouted from the mill door. And the whole yard came alive. Men slapped each other on the back. Someone rang the dinner bell, though breakfast had barely ended. Nora, who had come up from the Wren house to help with the books, covered her mouth and started laughing through tears. Elena did not laugh yet. 30 days was not victory. 30 days was a promise with teeth. The first shipment nearly broke them. Spring thaw came hard. Snowmelt swelled the river and ate at the lower bank near the mill wheel. One saw line cracked 2 weeks before delivery. 3 wagons sank axle deep on the North Road. Merrick's men did not appear with threats this time. They did not need to. Weather. Wait. And time did half his work for him. Caleb wanted to ask the railroad for grace. Elena said no. Grace is what men ask for when they have no plan. She said. Spreading the route maps across the office table. We have a plan. She sent raw timber to Morrison Mill for emergency finishing. Even though the cost made Caleb go quiet. She shifted the best teams to night hauling when the road froze hard. She paid workers extra for the dangerous hours and wrote every coin into the ledger where anyone could see it. The shipment reached the depot 6 hours before deadline. Every board matched the tag. Every tag matched the ledger. Every ledger line had a witness. Edwin Carver signed the receipt himself. After that, Merrick could still hate them. But he could no longer make their numbers disappear. The railroad posted a new rule at the depot. All contract lumber would be measured in public. With 2 witnesses and a signed board-foot slip. It was a small notice on cheap paper. But it did what speeches could not. It took the dark out of the measuring. 18 months changed the valley. Ashford timber expanded. But not the way Merrick would have. Caleb bought new saw equipment. But Elena insisted the first new building be a proper bunkhouse with dry floors and windows that opened. They hired more men. Then hired 2 widows to run the cookhouse for wages written in the same book as everyone else's. Nora did not marry Evan Miller. She took over the depot copybook instead. Recording each outgoing load with a steadier hand than anyone expected. The first time a hauler tried to argue the fee, Nora turned the ledger around and tapped the line with her pencil. Records do not blush, she said. Elena laughed for the first time in days. At the end of the first contract year, Elena opened a new page in the office ledger. Workers' Share Board. Caleb read the title. Then looked at her. That will cost us. So did being small enough to be threatened. He considered that. Then dipped the pen. But instead of signing, he handed it to her. You first. The room went quiet. Foreman. Haulers. Nora. Martin. All of them watched Elena write her name at the top of the page. Elena Wren Ashford. Only then did Caleb sign beside her. By autumn, Wren Road had changed too. The red paint was gone. shaved from the gateboard until only a pale scar remained. Small haulers were allowed through for a public fee. Posted at the trading post, the depot, and the mill office. No favors. No whispered rates. No man paying more because he was afraid to ask why. One morning, an old hauler who had once paid Merrick double just to keep his wagon moving stopped at the gate. He read the posted fee twice, counted out the coins, and waited for someone to add a hidden charge. Nora wrote his name in the book. "That is all," she said. The old man looked at the open road. Then at Elena. "Never thought I'd see a fair gate in this county." Elena did not answer right away. She only touched the pale scar where the red paint had been. When Silas Wren died, he died in his own bed, with the window open toward the road he had built. Elena sat beside him until the last light left the room. Caleb waited outside on the porch, hat in his hands, giving grief the space business never did. A week later, Elena returned to the gate. The old red-marked board had been turned into a plank for the new sign. Caleb had brought the nails but did not lift the hammer. That was hers. Elena placed the sign against the post and drove in the first nail. Then the second. Then the last. Wren Road opened by record. Not favor. Caleb stood behind her. Your father would have liked that. He would have corrected the lettering. He would have been right. She looked at him then. And for once neither of them turned the moment into work. Caleb reached into his coat and took out the old measuring cord. The one he had given her when their marriage was still a bargain, and trust was only a risk on paper. "I think this belongs in the office now," he said. Elena took it from him. "Not locked away." "No," he said. "Hung where anyone can use it." Together, they hung it beside the road ledger. The following spring, the railroad sent a renewal contract. Edwin Carver came himself, carrying the papers in a leather case. He placed them on the office table and looked to Caleb first. Caleb did not pick up the pen. He slid it across the table to Elena. "She knows the road," he said. Elena looked at the contract, then at Caleb, then at the open window, where the sound of wagons rolled up from Wren Road. This time, she was not signing because a red mark had trapped her. She was not signing because her father was sick. She was not signing because a man had offered her rescue. She signed because the road was hers to keep honest. Their marriage had begun as a contract written under pressure. Now it was a life measured in harder things. Trust, work, risk, and the choice, made every day. To build something neither of them could have saved alone. This is a fictional story created for educational and entertainment purposes. All characters, events, places, and situations are imaginary. Any resemblance to real people, living or dead, or real events is purely coincidental.